So I really appreciate being allowed to give a talk about licensing to a technical mini-conf. It is very kind of the organizers to let me do that. And I generally feel that developers are at an unfair disadvantage because lawyers are constantly telling you that you don't understand the legal issues. You can probably learn enough pretty quickly, possibly even from this talk, to understand the legal issues, at least about Linux's license, better than most of them do. Now, you shouldn't hold that over them. Use it as a mechanism to engage them in conversation and push back when lawyers at your company are telling you to do something that doesn't really make sense to you. You can say no to your lawyers. A lot of people don't realize in a business, the lawyers are not in charge. They are there as advisors to advise the business people primarily. So convincing the business person is the more important thing because they can tell the lawyer, yes, we hear you, but we don't care. Now, why should you as an engineer or developer care about anything to do with legal issues? I, like you, started my career as a software developer and system administrator, which dates me because sysadmins don't call themselves that anymore. They all say they work in DevOps. But I like to do cool things with computing too. I'd rather spend most of my time doing that. And in fact, I got into free software because I thought proprietary licenses were in my way. It stopped me from being able to do cool things with computing. So I would like them to get out of my way. I would like the GPL sometimes to even get out of my way. But it's the value of the GPL that makes Linux free. So what I want to do is give you enough information so that the license doesn't get in your way and actually is a tool to you to help assure your software freedom, that your users' software freedom, and so forth. And perhaps you can learn enough that you can teach other developers at least the basic information. So the reason I put this quote from Harry Potter up is because lawyers act like going to law school is like going to Hogwarts. That anybody who doesn't have a law degree is some sort of muggle, and they don't understand anything. But as Harry says, every great wizard was just a student at one point. The only thing you can't do without a law degree is represent someone as a lawyer. You can learn everything that is there in a law school. The books are not exactly freely available, but they're there. The information is out there. I'm not a lawyer. I can't give you legal advice. But generally speaking, I know a lot more about most copyright issues than most lawyers, unless they're a lifelong copyright specialist. So you can get to that point as well. So I want to give you the ability to ask intelligent questions, to be able to figure out how to explain the software side of how it interacts with licensing. So some of this is really basic information. I know there's already some people in the audience who know things about legal issues, so I'll go relatively quickly through this part. And if you have questions at the end, feel free to ask them if there was a missing piece somewhere in there. So you get this thing called a software license. You've probably heard of that before. So to put it in sort of generalized terms, to get a license means you've gotten some set of permissions, perhaps with requirements that you also have to meet conditionally to be able to receive those permissions. Proprietary licenses are usually really focused on forming a business relationship with you as a customer or user. So they have some sort of contractual arrangement between you and the company. For example, when you use Google services, you contract with them to give them all your data about yourself for any purpose they would care to use it for. And for that, you get some zero-cost proprietary software. I don't like making that deal myself, but that's basically how most proprietary software licenses are structured. Free and open source software licenses can be treated as contracts as well, but they're primarily, the legal mechanism that they primarily rely on to transfer these permissions and requirements around is under copyright. So when you look at a proprietary license, it's going to be thought of as a contract first and a copyright license second. When you look at a free software license, it'll typically be looked as a copyright license first and a contractual arrangement second. So from the point of view of the legal system, and this is actually well internationalized through a thing called the Berne Convention on Copyright, software, in that it is a series of textual statements that you write, it is governed by copyright in any country that has signed the Berne Convention on Copyright, which is nearly every country, certainly every country in the industrialized world. So everything that's in text can be governed by copyright, and therefore software, at least the primary legal system that ends up governing software, is copyright. So copyright was invented primarily for books, because those were the first things that were ever put in print, ever distributed and copied and distributed around the world. So there's a lot of biases in the worldwide copyright systems thinking in terms of books. For example, back in the US, they ask you when you submit a work for registration of copyright in the United States, you send the first 25 pages and the last 25 pages of the work. I have been debating for 20 years with the copyright license, copyright registration office in the US and with every copyright lawyer I meet, what exactly is the first 25 pages and the last 25 pages of a software program? No one knows the answer yet, and the Copyright Registration Library of Congress, who runs it in the United States, has not given any guidance whatsoever on this question after, at this point, 40, 50 years of software existing. This is the book bias showing itself. But the other parts of what governs for books fit pretty well with software. They govern the copying, modifying, and distributing of works under a copyright, and a book is a work just like software is a work. And we have pretty good working understandings of what it means to copy, modify, or distribute a work of software. Copyright by default in Berne Convention countries turns all these permissions by default. If you get a copyrighted work and you don't have any permission, you don't get a license with it, you have no permission to copy, modify, or distribute the work. In most countries, you get something called a bundle of fair use rights, or fair dealing, it's called in some countries, where you're allowed to at least do things like look at the work and make use of it and so forth. But you really don't have a permission to do any type of modifications or improvements or changes. So ultimately what a license is supposed to do is if it's going to be free software, just to say, at the very least, you are allowed to copy, modify, and distribute. And every free software license does that. The question is, should a free software license do more than that? I tend to like licenses that do a little bit more than just give you permission to copy, modify, and distribute the work. And that's why I like these things called copyleft licenses. Copyleft is a policy framework that uses copyright to advance certain policy goals of software freedom. So a copyleft license will do the same thing every other foss license will do. It'll first give you permission to copy, modify, and distribute the work. And then it will add conditional requirements that you have to do when you engage in those activities. And all of those requirements, if it's a well-structured copyleft license, should be focused on assuring the downstream users have the freedom to copy, share, modify, and distribute the works as well. That's where we get this share and share alike idea with copyleft. So this is a working definition of copyleft that was originally from Wikipedia. I made some edits to this myself for copyleft.org, but it's pretty much the version that you see on Wikipedia. And my favorite word in the entire definition is that word, strategy. Because I think a lot of people think of copyleft as some sort of moral cause on itself. Copyleft is merely a tool. It is a tool that I have seen used well. It is a tool that I have seen abused badly. But when it's used in the way it was intended, it's a tool to advance software freedom, not a goal unto itself, per se. So the GNU General Public License, which is a part of Linux license, I'll get to that later, is an implementation of copyleft. Copyleft is a specification. GPL is its implementation. GPL is one of its implementations. Generally speaking, the copyleft idea can be applied to any type of copyrighted work. The GPL is specifically a copyleft written for software. So it has a bunch of detailed rules, which are mostly technological in nature, not legal in nature, although they're embodied in a legal document, to assure that downstream users have the freedom to copy, share, modify, and improve the software. And that, most importantly, they can make effective use of those freedoms, that they actually work. That it's not a theoretical question that they can modify and reinstall and improve the software, but they actually have the clear path and means to do so. So the goal of copyleft basically is to make sure everybody who gets a copy of the program has the standard 4 freedoms of free software. That's its goal. So as I mentioned, all of these foss licenses are primarily copyright license. So to apply the GPL to a program, you copyright the software. As it turns out, that happens automatically when you write software. By the way, in most countries, if you write software and are employed to do it, your employer holds that copyright, not you. As a side point, when you go to get a job, the first thing you should ask them, after you get a really great salary, which you all do as Linux developers, you should tell them, I really want to keep my own copyrights. And that's not negotiable. Then you are the one deciding to put it under GPL. By the way, one thing you should be willing to give away is you'll promise to GPL everything you write as part of your job under your own copyright. So you use the GPL to grant those key freedoms. The requirements that are added by the GPL prohibit anybody else to take away those freedoms. So when you look at the GPL, you find the phrase provided that appearing a lot in the license, because it says you can do A, some sort of activity like modifying, distributing, copying the software, provided that you do some B, which is that B is designed to assure the next person who gets the software has the same ability to do A that you did. So there's basically two classes of copyleft. There's strong copyleft, like the GPL, which is a copyleft license that attempts to maximally use the copyright system to defend software freedom. I'm not sure, both Jeremy Allison and Michael Meeks, I think, came up with this example independently. They called the GPL like judo, because apparently, I'm not a martial artist, but in judo, one of the goals is to use the aggression of the opponent to change the direction and push back on it. It's exactly what strong copyleft tries to do. The more copyright pushes controls and powers onto the world, the more copyleft uses those powers to push back and make sure that they're always used to defend software freedom. So it's going to go as far as it can. This is why this derivative works argument comes up all the time, because people say the GPL doesn't tell me what a derivative work is. And our answer always is, well, copyright law in the various jurisdictions that you are in talk about derivative work, combined works, works derived from the program, all those sorts of things. And whatever your copyright system says is a derivative work, GPL covers that. And lawyers say, why don't you define the GPL? I said, because we want to go as absolutely far as we can go in any jurisdiction, because that was the whole point of strong copyleft. By contrast, weak copyleft is actually more complicated, because weak copyleft has inside the license a bunch of technical details of certain types of things, even if the copyright system would call it a derivative or combined work or a modified work, you're still allowed to do. The LGPL, which everybody has their own idea of what they think the LGPL says. I find very, very few people actually read it, because if they did, they would never use the license. But it has these detailed requirements of a work that uses the library versus a work based on the library. And those are, again, primarily technical, software-focused rules that you have to follow. And when it fits the definition of a work that uses the program, you can make that code somewhat proprietary. And if it's a work based on the library, then you have to release it just as you would with the GPL. So the primary place where GPL hooks onto things is in the right to modify, because it ties into this derivative work thing. The idea is to allow people to make private modifications as much as they like, and then tie it to distribution. So the key GPL requirements come up when you do both. When you modify, then distribute, that's when you really have the strictest, most detailed requirements of things you have to follow under GPL. This seems very reasonable to me, because you're now engaging in two different things that are governed by copyright, modification and distribution, and you got the software for absolutely zero cost, contributed by millions of people all over the world, developed for decades at this point, great software, and all you have to do is, if you happen to engage in modification and distribution, you have some requirements you have to meet. It's a pretty reasonable bargain, and it amazes me that most people don't comply with the GPL. So the GPL section 2 is where most of this happened. This is the beginning of section 2. This talks about changes. By the way, most people never follow that, but it's rarely enforced. But it is technically, you do have to do that kind of marking, which, by the way, means that if you don't do it in the code, you probably might have to ship the Git repository with it if you're not going to make mark changes in the code. Just saying. But the key clause that's most interesting, this is kind of the core copyleft clause, the core place where it talks about the derivative work thing, is this section 2b. And GPL v2 is so clumsily worded because it was written in 1991. I think GPL v3 is much better worded in this regard. The number of times people look at that phrase at no charge and been confused about whether you can make money with the GPL software. That phrase is referring to the license can't have a fee, but people get confused by that. So this is kind of the central derivative work clause. I don't want to get too much into that until later. But I do want to talk about the derivative work question in general. So ultimately, when you're making modifications to software and you want to make a derivative work, the GPL says you have to release it. I often glibly just tell people, well, if you GPL everything, you never have to worry about what's a derivative work and what isn't, because it's only if you want to make proprietary software that you ever have to ask this question. So people have to do risk analysis. My view is why do they want to test this boundary in the first place? I am truly flabbergasted the number of companies that are constantly testing this boundary, and they're doing it mostly with Linux. Linux is the place where the boundaries of derivative works are being tested more than not just any other free software, any other software in the world is where it's being tested, because companies, they really like making proprietary stuff. I don't understand it, but they do. And they want to take Linux and put proprietary stuff in it. And they want to get away with something. The extent to which NVIDIA has spent their entire existence trying to get away with things is just, it seems silly to me. You should certainly, there's a whole section in the Copyleft guide that talks about the various different rules and legal decisions about derivative works around the globe. It's worth reading. It's worth asking your lawyers to read it. I think that unless you're NVIDIA, unless you're a company that's obsessed with circumventing the GPL, hurting free software, these derivative work questions are just not going to come up so much. The other thing that's also true under the GPL is you can always remove the copylefted software if you're unhappy at the outcome. So a lot of people have always thought that, oh, if somebody violates the GPL, we've got them, we get all their code. That's not true. They always have the option to remove it. In fact, if you've heard about the VMware case that we worked on for basically 10 years, the ultimate resolution we got, which was not ideal for us, was we got them to remove the Linux code from their ESXi product. That was an option for them. We would have rather that they just GPL'd the ESXi product because they based it on Linux, and in fact it didn't work without all of the entire SCSI subsystem from Linux. It could boot up, but it couldn't read a hard drive, so I don't know how useful that is. But they chose, nope, we're going to rewrite all that Linux code that we stole 10 years ago. We're just going to rewrite it. That's what they did, and that's how they came into compliance. So removing the GPL code is always an option. So even if you make a mistake, or your company makes a mistake with regard to derivative works, they can always just stop using Linux. Now, people often say that's a glib answer because they say, well, I have to use Linux. And I say, no, you don't. VxWorks exists. Go license it if you really want proprietary software. So because the freedom of modification is the most important thing for developers for free software, so I think the most important thing certainly for Linux developers, they want to be able to see the code that someone gives them when they get a copy of Linux. Source code is ultimately the center place of what you need, right? Because you don't modify a binary work most of the time. People do, they reverse engineer it, but that's much more painful than modifying the source. So there are many, many provisions in the GPL that talk at length about source code provisioning, assuring that the source code is given downstream when you do that modification and distribute. And the reason this works is because binaries are just text, modified versions of the software. So they're covered just by copyright like any other thing. The binaries are copyrighted too. And to get permission to create that derivative work, binary being a derivative work of the source, you need the copyright permissions from the GPL, and therefore the compiled code that's modified by the compiler it is also covered by the GPL. I think a lot of people forget that, because a lot of people forget that the binary itself is also licensed under the GPL. There's no other license it's allowed to be under. So it's not like the binary is under one license and the source code's under GPL. No, the binary is under GPL, and then there's sections in the GPL that lay out the technical details of what you have to do to provision the source code. And this is where I think developers and engineers are the most useful people in discussions about GPL and compliance. Because when you get to that point where you've distributed a binary work, a binary copy of Linux under GPL, and there's the question of, is this the right source code for it? All of the decisions and figuring out if it's the right source code is a technological problem, not a legal problem. And so you are, if your company's having, say, trouble complying with GPL on Linux, which a lot of companies are, so probably people in this room have companies that are having such trouble, they would do best to rely on you to help them figure that out rather than asking other lawyers. So from my point of view, the most important requirement in the GPL is the requirement to provide complete corresponding source. And years ago, we made an acronym for that. We call it CCS, because GPL says those words, complete corresponding source, so we call it CCS. So ultimately, what the idea behind CCS is trying to do is to assure that when a downstream user gets the binary, they can reproduce and install that binary, just as the upstream that gave them to them did. So this is the actual text of GPL that talks about how to do this. I think the most important phrase, and the phrase that I've spent most of my career dealing with, is the last few words. The scripts used to control compilation and installation of the executable. I have had half-day-long conference calls talking about the word "the" in that phrase. By the way, the scripts, I think we've pretty much figured out that as long as the scripts work, they don't have to be the original ones you used, because frequently people will write a proprietary build system and they don't want to give that away. And so then when you find them out of compliance, you ask for the scripts, and they say, we don't want to give you the scripts. And for a while, I would say, we have to. It says the scripts. And we figured out we can't really rely on the word the to mean it has to be the actual scripts, because it doesn't say the actual scripts. It just says the scripts. So any working scripts are OK. But this is the level of detail that GPL violators like to get into when they violate the GPL. They will spend days with us debating whether or not the scripts means they have to give us the scripts or not. So one of the things we do when we enforce the GPL for Linux is we evaluate the CCS. We actually try to build it. And after 20-some years of doing this, I'm sad to say it's pretty much a know it when you see it kind of standard. We do have one example in the Copyleft.org guide that has an example of a very good CCS candidate that we looked at and worked well and is worth imitating and emulating. But I usually see people just barely get across the finish line, kind of huffing and panting. The one in the Copyleft guide is the only one that I saw go sailing, running way past the finish line, and still sprinting along. So the test that we do is we actually try to build and install the thing. So if we get, it's usually embedded devices that are violating the GPL IoT devices, we say, OK, can we build this from source? And can we install a copy of Linux, our own Linux binary, back in place where the other Linux was? And if we can't build and install it, then it's not including at least the proper scripts to control compilation and installation of executable. And I've been making this recommendation for at least 10 years, probably 15. And I have not yet seen a company that does this. They spend millions of dollars now on the compliance industrial complex, when all they could have done for every product is hire one extra engineer just for like a week at the end of the process, who's never seen the product before, hand them the source release and say, can you build and install Linux from this source release that we're going to give to everybody who asks for it? If the answer is no, you're not complying with the GPL. If the answer is yes, you're most likely complying with GPL modulo proprietary kernel module issues that I'll talk about in a minute. I'm flabbergasted that not a single company does this. And of course, the reason is they'd much rather give millions of dollars to Black Duck than actually comply with the GPL, it turns out. So obviously, I like Copyleft a lot. It's my favorite form of licensing. I like this joke about the ISC license. People say, oh, I love the ISC license. It's so simple. The joke is, it's simple because it doesn't do anything. It gives you a bunch of permissions, but it doesn't assure anything for anybody other than the original author. And in fact, any proprietary license does that for us. But I do want to at least give you mainly because I want to show you how bad I am at making charts, what the kind of layout of foss licensing is, right? So you can kind of think of it as a two-dimensional spectrum. On the one hand, there's these highly permissive licenses, like the ISC license, that give you software freedom. They give you the right to copy, modify, and distribute software. And then there's the far end of Copyleft, which are licenses that contain a lot more requirements that seek to assure software freedom. So I just throw that up there mainly because, you know, I should have some graphics, and I'm not good at graphics, so now you know how bad I am at graphics. So one of the most important things about Linux's license is that not all of it is GPL'd. Not every little piece of Linux is GPL'd. Licenses, it turns out, are hackable like software. So you can take any strong copyleft license, something on that far end of the spectrum, and make it weaker, i.e. make it less copylefted and more like the ISC license, by adding an additional permission. These are often called exceptions. I've been trying to remove that word from the lexicon, like single-handedly, so it hasn't gone that well. But the word exception has a very specific, well, not very specific, but a cognitive meaning for engineers. When they hear exception, they think that's something bad and negative, like, oh, you know, it threw an exception, it's screwed up. But additional permissions are actually reasonably good things and useful. So I kind of, even though it's longer, I kind of lean towards the additional permission phrasing. So I'm finally going to actually talk about Linux. Linux has now appeared on a slide for the first time, halfway through a talk about Linux's license. So I thank you for your patience for waiting this long to see the word Linux up there. We all know Linux is a very technically complicated project. It is probably one of the most complicated license-wise software projects in the foss world as well, mainly because it's big. But there is a single thing you can think about that will generally give you 98% of what's true about Linux's license. The effective license of Linux as a whole is GPLv2 only. But many parts of it have additional permissions that you could extract and use under different licenses. So that's the summary. That's the basic idea of what's going on with Linux license. I'm going to dig a little bit into that. First of all, what's this GPLv2 only thing? So those of you that were around during GPLv3 drafting, remember there was a fight about this. The thing I try to point out as we analyze that fight historically is that GPL is actually maybe the only copyleft license that I've ever seen that doesn't have an auto upgrade clause, and people don't realize this. In licensing, an auto upgrade clause means that when the license steward publishes a new version of the license, the code that you released under the prior version automatically is relicensed to the world without your action under the new license. So what's this thing? What's the license steward? Well, the license steward is who published the original document of license. So the license steward of GPL is not the Linux project, it's the Free Software Foundation. The license steward of the Mozilla Public License is not any random author of MPL, it's the Mozilla Foundation. The license steward of the Eclipse license is the Eclipse Foundation. So there's a lot of interesting tools there, obviously. I don't much care for auto upgrade clauses myself. I think it's actually better to do it the way that we do it in GPL. I'm sorry, there's actually a repeat of those slides. I apologize. Oh, that's the slide I was looking for. Sorry. Yeah. So I think it's a little weird. You know, when you license your code, right? You've read the license, you like it, you pick that license. The idea that a license steward can come along and take control and decide a different version of license, I'm kind of, like, initially, like, I thought that the Linux community should just trust the FSF, whatever they did. And I've come around to where the Linux community was coming from during GPLv3, right? You don't want somebody you've maybe never met, or somebody who hasn't been born yet, because copyright lasts a long time, you see, to be the person to decide the next license of your software. You might want to entrust somebody you know. So I think it's totally reasonable that these things don't have, like, to not have an auto upgrade clause. I think it's better, and it's reasonable. So I already said this. Sorry about that. So obviously, a lot of people don't like GPLv3. I'm pretty much a fan of GPLv3. I think it's got some problems. There was some lobbying during the drafting process and has a bunch of verbiage in it that doesn't need to be there. So I actually think it's OK. And I think it's a good idea to license your code GPLv2 or later. But as I was saying, I certainly understand why you would license it under v2 only. And it's really kind of a question of how you feel about GPLv3, whether you want your code licensed under GPLv3 or not. That's an individual decision. I think that's a decision each individual developer should be making. The problem we have in Linux right now is in most cases it's companies that hold your copyright that are making this decision. So you don't get to make it for yourself. Your company gets to make it if they pay you to write code. Again, as I mentioned, tell your company you want to keep your own copyrights and make this decision yourself. Now, I do want to point out that there are large, contrary to popular belief, there are large amounts of GPLv2 or later code floating around in Linux. So remember how I said the effective license was v2 only? That's because once you add one line, or maybe one line's not copyrightable, but once you add like a substantial portion that's under GPLv2 only, you kind of have to go to the lowest common denominator license, which is why Linux's license is GPLv2 only. But you could certainly find parts of Linux that you could clearly show a code provenance that it was under GPLv2 or later, and then you could use that under GPLv3 if you wanted to. So there's also lots of these additional permissions floating around the Linux code base. This is the oldest one and perhaps the least understood one, in part because Linus wrote it when his English was not as good as it is now, and in part because well, there's lots of reasons, problems with this, but it does talk about this thing called a syscall, a system call. And a system call tends to be another one of these know it when you see it kind of things for Linux developers. So I think it's a great example of what I was saying earlier about how technical analysis is really important. I mean, this is ultimately a legal document here. This is legally binding, and lawyers have spent more time arguing about this, believe it or not, than even Linux developers have. Because lawyers are obsessed with this thing because, I think NVIDIA believes that it means they can make every module proprietary because they believe everything is a syscall. We don't agree with them, of course, but it's the technical folks that ultimately would decide this. And just to give a little bit of flavor to this, ultimately these kinds of questions are decided in courts, right? Courts like expert witnesses. They like people who understand the field. So if there is ever litigation over the question of what the syscall exception means or doesn't mean, both sides will call people like you from the Linux community to say, I believe that wasn't a syscall, and here's why. Because no one would really think, no one who's in their right mind as a technical person would think that's a syscall. And then somebody else will come in and say, I absolutely believe it's a syscall. And then the court will decide which expert is right. So you being an expert on this kind of stuff is really important to the future of Linux's license. It comes down to, if somebody's reasonably skilled in the art, what would they think is a normal system call? So as we all know, syscalls are generally a way that stuff that's not in kernel space talks to a resource that's in kernel space. The goal here, we sort of have a general sense of what the goal was. The goal was to say, well, you can write user space code and it doesn't have to be GPL. That was sort of the original intent. So the thing is that we just made that up. There's nowhere not a copyright statute in the globe has a definition of syscall in it. Half of them don't even have a definition of software in it. So the other thing is that copyright law was designed as a way for people to make money from works, right? It was a way to restrict people from doing things, and then you say, oh, you want to do that thing? You want to modify? That costs this much money. You want to redistribute? That costs this much money. It wasn't designed for what Copyleft does. Copyleft was this innovative hack on copyright, which means there's no discussion of what you should do if we say, we don't want money. In fact, you couldn't buy off every Linux developer you tried. So you actually have to figure out whether your thing is a syscall or not to see whether you have an exception, because you can't just go pay everybody in Linux to give you a different license. None of these questions, none of these kinds of questions have ever been considered by any court in the world, really. There's a couple of cases in the US. There's an interesting case in the UK that kind of gets into this kind of stuff, but it's all about proprietary stuff, and in the end, everybody settles and just somebody pays somebody some money to get what they want. And this is, again, why you have so much power in this, because what we think as experts, as technical experts, will decide what really happens in any kind of legal disagreement that comes up. So I've obviously thought about this question a lot. I've known about this syscall exception since late 90s at some point is when I first heard about it. And I recently did an analysis of GPIO because I was working with some of the embedded folks about this question of like, oh, does the syscall exception apply? So I looked at the /sys way of talking to GPIO, and I said, okay, is that a syscall, right? Well, it's weird, right? Because it's not a system call like we would think. Like, it's not like calling a C function, but is it a syscall? I pretty much decided it was. And one of the reasons that really convinced me is I found this in the documentation. And it said, oh. Now, even though it says it's deprecated, it's telling the user, this is the way you talk to this system interface as user space. And so that, to me, that feels like it should be a syscall. Because it's like, well, OK, the developer said, when you're sitting in user space and you want to talk to my subsystem, this is what you should do. But it's deprecated, so don't use it. In fact, what you should be using is this newer thing, which I think is, I've never said this out loud, Lib GPIOD, is that what it's called? Or as I said, it was Lib GPIOD? PIOD, would that sound cool? Lib GPIOD. Anyway, so this is I'm told by the embedded developers, I'm not an embedded developer myself yet, this is a better API for talking to GPIO. And I looked at the code a little bit, and it looked to me like it makes normal system calls in the way you would think. So it's an interesting example of kind of layering copyleft, because of course Linux is GPL'd with this syscall exception. So it means you can make proprietary works if you want. But what the Lib GPIOD developers said is, well, we actually want to copyleft that too, but we only want to make it a weak copyleft because we want the works that use the library to be proprietary if people want, but we want changes to the library to have to be under copyleft. So I think it's really an interesting way to approach that problem. So I didn't do a full derivative work analysis. I didn't look at the various different programs that use Lib GPIOD and figure out whether they were really derivative works or not. But I think that if I would be pretty flabbergasted if somebody did that analysis and said, oh, no, it turns out, yeah, if any program, the GPLv2 all the way from Linux goes all the way up into user space through the GPIO subsystem. I'd be surprised if a court came to that conclusion. Now, courts have surprised us all sorts of times with really crazy decisions, so it could happen. So I do want to speed up a little bit so I can leave some time for questions. I want to talk a little bit about this dual license thing. Because this is kind of unique to Linux, and dual licensing isn't unique to Linux, but this dual licensing of various parts of Linux with BSD, maybe after the talk somebody can educate me why this tradition started. I have a good sense, wait, Keith, you started it? No, you got rid of it. Keith got rid of it. Keith didn't start it. But I'd like to know where it started. But I'm guessing it was ostensibly for code sharing with BSD. I mean, that was sort of, I guess, the initial idea that would happen. But the interesting thing that's happened with it, and I think it's great that Keith's trying to end it, is I think that it's really been exploited by companies. One of the ways it's been exploited by companies is, and Qualcomm is really kind of the worst on this regard, is they discovered that there are certain types of implicit patent licenses under GPLv2. And they said, wait a second. If Linux upstream will take BSD code, BSD licensed code, because it's compatible with GPL, so it can go upstream. But when Qualcomm upstreams something under BSD, they are not granting the implicit patent license under GPL because they didn't release it under GPL, they released it under BSD. And early on, Qualcomm figured this out. Was like, ooh, we want to upstream things in BSD because then we can later argue we never gave you a patent license under GPLv2's implicit patent license. So I think you should stop taking, this is a good part's getting a quote on OBM. I think you should stop taking upstream stuff that's not under GPLv2. But the other thing is that there are companies out there, not Qualcomm in this case, but other companies I won't mention, that think they somehow get around copyleft themselves by only ever contributing upstream under BSD. That somehow they're not bound by Linux's copyleft in some way. And I've heard this argument made in kind of back smoke-filled rooms of lawyers. And so those are the two reasons why I'm not a fan of this dual license thing. I mean, I get you want to be friendly to the BSD people. I mean, Why anybody can be friendly to Tue Jan anymore, I don't know, but it's a nice thing to want to be friendly to people, even that aren't friendly with you, but I don't think it's worth it. I think it's not good for the copyleft on Linux to continue with the whole do licensing thing. So I've left a very brief time to talk about proprietary kernel modules, because I suspect that's when people have questions, that's what they want to ask about. So I don't know what courts are going to say about proprietary kernel modules. I know as somebody who's worked in software and as an amateur copyright expert, non-lawyer for years, I have never seen a proprietary kernel module that, in my honest academic approach, did not look like a derivative work of Linux as a whole. I've never seen it. There is arguments about export symbol GPL and export symbol. If you look back at the history of that, it's very clear that was advisory only. And I don't think it makes a big difference. I think it's better to put export symbol GPL because you've put people on more notice than they would be otherwise. So I think you should put export symbol GPL on your symbols. But whether it's export symbol or export symbol GPL, I think a proprietary kernel module, at least everyone I've ever seen in the real world, has triggered the modification / derivative work standards in the copyright regimes that I'm familiar with. Obviously, we know of companies that have spent, at this point, decades getting away with violating the GPL in this regard. It is not an easy task to enforce the GPL. We do a lot of work on it. I'm not going to say too much about kind of strategy about that, because I had a habit of talking about our strategies publicly, and then companies heard about them and developed counter strategies before we implemented our strategies. So I'm a little more guarded than I used to be about that sort of stuff. But I'm happy to talk offline with people if they want to hear more about what Conservancy is doing on this. Conservancy is the only organized group of people doing enforcement of the GPL for Linux right now. The others who have done it in the past are no longer doing it, generally speaking, because they moved on to other projects. We're it. I know you didn't elect us, and maybe you aren't happy with us doing it, but if you want it done at all, we're the only game in town at the moment. We'd love if other people wanted to do it independently, at least not in the Patrick McCarty sense, but in the Howard Velta sense. But at this point, nobody has time or inclination, because it's hard and painful and expensive work to do. So I want to just end with this. Licensing analysis is very complicated. But like I said earlier on, it's only complicated when you want to do something proprietary. If you're doing all your development in the open, you're doing everything upstream first, the licensing details of Linux are just not that complicated. If you have a rule where you just release everything under your favorite GPL compatible license, even if it's BSD or Qualcomm and you only release under BSD, at least it's all being done in the open. And so you don't get compliance problems if you're doing all your work upstream. And there are lots of technical reasons that you all make all the time, quite correctly, that people should just be working upstream. So it solves the licensing problems, it solves the technical problems. Why not just everybody do that and encourage your employers to do it as well? With that, I have 7 minutes, according to my counter, I have for questions. Thank you. He's got a mic, so I'm not going to pick people. I'll let him pick people with a mic.
Just a question. I have an opinion, but I'll let you do your opinion, because mine's not important. But the syscall, normal syscall statement, have you thought about that in terms of the IOCTL syscall, which is not really normal? It's it's a conduit for whatever the hell you want. And I get this sort of normal in the sense of it's open, read, write, they're normal. Is something I create specifically to run a binary in user space using a normal syscall if I create that API just for that?
Yeah, I mean, people have talked. I don't know much about what's being done because I'm not an upstream Linux developer. But I've been told situations where you can hack ioctl to ship a binary firmware into Linux, right? And I can't imagine a court looking at and saying. I mean, it could happen, right? I mean, a court could say, "Oh yeah, system IOCTL is a system call, right?" So they use the system call. But courts, so we've only been in front of judges a few times with GPL violations, and my experience sitting, of course, the lawyers are there arguing. I'm just representing the plaintiff, Software Freedom Conservancy. But sitting in the gallery and listening to the judges don't like when people play games. I think one of the weirdest things that's happened with the GPL is you have this weird marrying of the kind of the playful hackerish sense that geeks have. You know, they're like, oh, I know how to hack around this problem. I can do this really complicated thing. And then lawyers who are just thrilled at having something interesting to do, because most of what lawyers do all day is like read boring documents. But this stuff is like kind of cool. And they're like, oh, let's sit down and create a weird, complicated system to circumvent the GPL. And we'll totally convince a judge of this, because I can't wait to argue this in front of a judge. But judges are like, are you kidding me? Like, did you know you were supposed to release all the source code to everything? Yes, Your Honor. And you did this so that you wouldn't have to release the source code of that weird thing you sent through the IOCTL, right? Well, yes, Your Honor. I can totally imagine a judge saying, get out of my court. You just release the thing or stop using Linux, whatever you want, but this is totally silly. Now, we could go the other way, right? Somebody could be hard-nosed and say, oh, IOCTL is a syscall. But one other thing I want to mention. Notice that I said the effective license of all of Linux is GPL v2 only. There is code in Linux that does not have the syscall exception on it. End of statement. There is code that's been brought from other GPL projects and put in Linux. So the entire license of Linux is not with the syscall exception. So even if you're relying on the syscall exception, the question will then become, well, was there code that was part of your build that came from one of the things that was not including the syscall exception? So that'll be a fight too. So I think in both sides of it, I think the IOCTL thing is something we should deal with. And I think the best thing to do right now is just refuse to work with companies that are trying to do these kind of goofy tricks. Don't take it upstream. Don't support their features upstream. And tell them to go away and leave the community until they become serious upstream developers. That's what you can all do now about that problem. And in the long term, I think the courts will figure it out. But courts take decades to figure out things that we can figure out in 5 minutes. OK.
I think we've got time for one more question.
So the question of how sort of far-reaching the GPL licenses was a question in my current company, and the question was essentially like, if what we write does fall under the GPL license, how are we supposed to make it available? Is there a level of sort of compliance that we have to exhibit, or could I just take whatever I've written that's proprietary, put it on 3.5-inch disks, and ship that in a crate to you, for example?
So as far as your 3.5-inch disk question, the phrase medium customary for software interchange appears in the GPL. I don't know if 3.5-inch disks would any longer be considered a medium customary for software interchange anymore. So that probably wouldn't work. I think the most important thing to do is whatever you need source code-wise and build script-wise to make the software build and install, that's what the GPL means to include. So if somebody can download your source release, who bought your product, and build and install the software, replace it, make modifications themselves, then you're most likely in compliance. The guide on copyleft.org that's up there on a link, and if you go to the slides on the website, there's a link to it, has like pages and pages and pages talking about how to put together a compliant source release. So I definitely refer you to that if you want to kind of read more about that, what you need to do.
That answers my question. Thank you.
Great.
All right. Please thank Bradley.
Thank you.